Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today we are taking a look at why Labour's completely short-sighted, envious policies have ended up just biting them in the backside. So for those that don't know, Labour for quite a while in their manifesto were making the point that obviously there needs to be more tax income because they want to fund much more things such as all of these unions that are demanding completely unreasonable pay rises for absolutely nothing in return. And so Labour have been making it quite clear that they are going to be targeting the rich. Hence, as I've shown in other videos, rich people are leaving in droves. We're talking over 10,000, getting close to 15,000 millionaires. The people that pay something like 40% of income tax. But it's also going after their education, and once they were elected in, we were seeing articles like this. Blindsided parents face dilemma over private school VAT. Bridget Phillipson says the government will move quickly to impose a 20% tax, perhaps as soon as January, which I think is the most cruel part of this. They weren't waiting until the terms were over. This is a mid-year, in-between term tax rise, which has completely screwed up how private schools operate. Because obviously parents are paying on a idea that they will be paying the same fees on a yearly basis, but this is up to the price mid-year because Labour were so desperate to get this policy out there. And head teachers at these private schools were saying similar things such as this. It would be a challenge for us if the VAT were imposed in January. We would have no choice other than to pass at least some of the costs on to parents, which would mean an effective mid-year rise. Also, most schools operate a term's notice for withdrawal of pupils, so technically if pupils were going to leave at Christmas, they would need to have given notice already, or at the very latest, the end of the summer holiday. This may lead to disagreements between schools and parents. The fairest thing would be to start it at the beginning of the next academic year. This would also avoid putting pressure on state schools, who would need to find places in schools mid-year and at short notice. This would be bad PR all round. We would try to minimise the effect on parents as much as we possibly can. And I want you to bear these numbers in mind. So the policy is expected to raise about £1.5 billion a year, which Labour has said funds 6,500 more teachers for state schools. So £1.5 billion a year. Bear that in mind, that's how much this is going to raise. And again, that's assuming that nobody actually leaves school, these private schools, to pay this tax. So, you know, this isn't going to be good. As time went on and it was clear they were bringing the VAT in January, we got headlines like this. Mid-year start for VAT on school fees is cruel and punitive. The head of the Independent Association of Prep Schools says the decision to introduce the tax rise in January is deliberately destructive, with headmasters saying things similar to the previous article. This punitive tax will have a devastating impact upon the education and welfare of children with special needs at a time when special needs provisions in the state sector is inadequate and a complete shambles. They are a violation of their human rights to education and freedom from discrimination. Many prep schools already cater for small numbers of pupils and are likely to be among the most vulnerable when VAT is added to bills. Norris, who represents 600 schools as head of IAPS, said in his letter there was no compelling logic for introducing the tax in January, beyond misconception it would raise more money for the government. It is not the start of the academic year for pupils, the fee year for schools, nor the fee payers' tax year, or even the government's budgetary year. A mid-year start creates numerous problems for schools, parents and the tax authorities that don't need to exist. January feels like an arbitrary date, attractive merely due to its proximity to the present. Large numbers of families will be forced now at very short notice to move their children elsewhere. You have cited previous annual rises in fees as evidence that parents will cope this time too, seeking to equate the gradual compounding of inflationary fee rises with a 20% hike in a single year. This isn't a credible argument. It's just embarrassing for the government overall, because yes, a lot of special needs kids are sent to private schools that specialise in special needs help, and they're typically quite good schools, hence they get paid for. Why Labour would be slapping this tax on private schools that are for special needs kids, I don't know. I know the reason, actually. It's because they have not put any thought into this. They just think, oh, private school, well, that's Eton, like rich upper-class people go there, they'll be able to handle it. When I believe the stats are about a third of parents who pay for private school places are actually middle-class people who are making sacrifices to pay for this sort of thing. And you get the typical leftist reply of, oh, just stop having avocados, which is obviously what boomers say to people saying I can't afford a house. When the thing is that they already are sacrificing the avocados, and you've literally pushed them out of this opportunity to do better for their child simply because not everyone can afford it, which is a ridiculous reason to slap this on. And this affects genuinely gifted kids who manage only to get to these schools on scholarships. VAT charge will force us to cut bursaries, say private school. Heads say poorer children will lose out on the chance to have private education, i.e. better education. Why? Because Labour have no idea what unintended consequences are. The incoming leader of Heads Conference, which represents top private schools such as Eton and Harrow, said that additional bursary places that could have been open to children will now not be open because of VAT. Philip Britton, the head of Bolton School, warned that the rise in fees, however it is managed, will make private schools even more exclusive. At Bolton School, a co-ed day school for children up to 18, he had planned to increase bursary provisions from 20% of pupils to 33% by 2030, but said the target was not now achievable. The challenge of VAT means that to keep fees right for our average parents who do not comfortably afford independent education but choose to do so, we will not be able to expand from 1 in 5 on bursaries to 1 in 3 as we had planned to do by 2030. This is a consequence of VAT, and it makes me sad rather than annoyed. We could be doing more good, and now we can't. So it is quite amazing that already the unintended consequence is, oh, now children who are particularly gifted and these schools actually want to be in their classrooms at a cheaper or even for completely free. Now we can't do that because the government wants to get their hands onto our school fees because they want to fund some other pet project. I mean, is this fair? Obviously not. Again, schools typically have a charitable status for a reason, and these bursaries are part of it, but now they're being forced to run as businesses, they can't do that anymore. Or if they want to do that, they still can, obviously, but where would the incentive be to do it? They're not going to let their business run into the ground just because you're now taxing them and forcing them into this awkward position. They're obviously going to try and keep going, because at the end of the day, they are still educating kids, which is a good thing. Some schools are trying to do what they can with the position they're in, though. Private faith schools in UK lobby for VAT exemption on fees under £7,690. Group says government policy would force many to close and leave deeply religious families with no alternative. So the group, representing more than 270 Jewish, Muslim and Christian independent faith schools that are often relying on donations and volunteers to survive, say the government's policy of adding 20% VAT to fees from this January would force many to close and leave deeply religious families with no alternatives. Sector leaders predict that some families could instead turn to unregistered illegal schools or lightly regulated homework clubs with little safeguarding protection. For the Christian, Jewish and Muslim families we represent, attending a faith school is not a choice, it is an integral to their way of life, the group told The Guardian. The head teacher of one Haredi Orthodox Jewish school in London said parents in our community simply cannot afford higher fees and we lack the resources to make up the shortfall. If this policy goes ahead, we will be forced to close our doors, and the result will be that thousands of Jewish children will be left without an appropriate education option, with many parents turning to home education as their only viable alternative. And this is what it all comes down to. This is what the consequences have been so far of this VAT being slapped onto schools. Education. No other country in the world has VAT on education. The Greeks tried it for about 3 months and had to stop because it was such a disaster. And Labour said, you know what, we want to do that. Because they're mental. But as I say, obviously the schools are fighting back in any way they can. They're lobbying the government to basically save state school places for people who are obviously going to leave private school. They're lobbying for VAT exemptions where they think they deserve it. Very specific to have it just under £8,000 a term, but whatever. Other schools saying that they can't get poor kids into their school to give them the best education they can because of this completely greedy and envious policy. But when it comes down to it, it is the elite, the most exclusive school that is doing the best thing that they can because they can afford the legal team to do it. And this is just the funniest thing I've ever seen. Eton among elite private schools set to cash in on windfall from new VAT rules. VAT-registered schools will be able to claim refunds for tax paid on capital projects over the past 10 years. Basically what has happened is, because the government have told these schools, right, you're not charity anymore, you are now business, they are now acting like a business and taking all the advantages that they can with that new label. and it could possibly ruin the government. A document issued by HMRC on Thursday made clear that once registered for VAT, independent schools will be able to claim back the tax they've paid on capital projects such as building and land acquisition completed over the past 10 years. The money will be paid back progressively over the next decade, with the timing and amounts dependent on what project was finished. The fact that institutions such as Eton College and other private elite schools will be able to attain a net benefit from the change is causing tension within the independent sector, with those running smaller private schools saying it will widen the gap between them and the richest. They say this is because the less wealthy smaller schools whose pupils' parents may not be so affluent will generally have to use any money they recoup to keep fees down, while the elite schools will simply use it to boost their balance sheet. It's an excellent case study in the law of unintended consequences. What do you want to happen? We want to put VAT on schools so that we can get more money. What ends up happening? Oh, we might actually lose money here. And part of the consequence of this was that effectively private schools would start shutting down. What ends up happening? Well, the ones that are actually elite, like Eton, end up actually doing better off with this new rule change. And then the ones that are lower down, these independent faith schools that are on about £8,000 a term, these other schools that are only able to actually try and keep their fees down and hand out bursaries, well, they can't do either of those things anymore, so that's not helpful. That pushes people even further out of the private education system. And so you've ended up just making the whole thing more elite, which the point of this was you were going to try and equalise everything. Well done. You've managed to do the complete opposite because you have no idea what you're doing. I say it every time. This Labour government is full of absolute rank amateurs with absolutely no vision for the future other than trying to put a jackboot on and trying to stamp it on the rich's face over and over. And so the rich either leave or actually play the game better than you, and you end up looking absolutely ridiculous from it. One senior figure in the independent sector told The Observer that the richer schools would benefit and the smaller ones would suffer. The higher echelons of the independent school sector are staying very quiet. They will be rubbing their hands in the hope that this is put in place as soon as possible. It is very public that Eton will be passing through the full 20% of VAT to parents, as will many of its peers. They will also be able to now claim VAT back on operating costs and are developing significant capital projects on which they will also be able to claim the VAT back. In short, the taxpayer will now be funding 20% of their running costs and capital projects. It is a windfall gain to the privileged independent schools at the expense of the taxpayer. The source said the smaller schools, with the parents who are going to struggle with affordability, will likely have to use any VAT reclaim to offset against school fees to help the parents. But top-tier schools whose parents' cohort can pay the 20% VAT will still reclaim the VAT, but just keep it themselves. Amazing. Despite intense pressure from teaching unions, accountants and the private sector to delay the plan in order to give schools more time to adapt, ministers intend to impose the 20% VAT on school fees from 1st of January next year because they're crazy, absolutely mental. If they were normal people, they would completely scrap this idea. It is clearly going to be a disaster. They say the money raised will help pay for 6,500 new teachers in the state sector, as well as a free breakfast club in all primary schools. Yeah, in reality, that's probably just going to pay for more Eton teachers and possibly free food for the teachers as well. When approached for comment, Eton College replied by sending a copy of a letter that it issued to parents and guardians in August explaining that the 20% VAT charge will be handed on to the parents. It also said that from January 2025, we will be able to recover VAT on certain costs and services that we purchase, which is about as gloaty as you can get for a professional institution like Eton. Rudolph Elliott Lockhart, head of the Independent Schools Association, which represents mainly similar independent schools, said, "This is a policy that will be felt very differently across a diverse range of independent schools. Most independent schools aren't currently oversubscribed, so a drop in demand caused by VAT will mean fewer pupils, which could push them into closure. Nor will most independent schools be able to take advantage of VAT rules that would mean they could reclaim significant sums back if only they had undertaken sizable capital spending over the previous decade. The irony is that the smaller number of independent schools that will be available to do this are the ones which have been used to stereotype the whole sector. I'm worried about the small local independent schools that are going to be pushed into closure by this policy. These are often schools using their independence to do things differently, offer special educational need provisions, or bilingual teaching, or performing arts focus, or meeting the needs of smaller religious communities. These are the schools that I think the Secretary of State would rather like if she actually visited them, yet these are the schools this policy is going to harm the most. There's still time for more nuanced policy that recognises that the independent sector is complex and diverse just like the state sector. They don't care. This is ideological. They won't care if they hear this might actually help Eton, because they've already got it in their minds, well, it's harming them and they need to pay their fair share of tax. And they'd rather just change the rules so that Eton can't try and reclaim tax, but in doing so, even though they've got an investor summit at the moment, it's probably going to mean that all businesses suffer, and once again, it's going to mean a much more stagnant UK. Mairead Warren de Bursa, Managing Director in charge of indirect taxes at the global professional services firm Alvarez and Marshall Tax LLP, said, in simple terms, if a school incurred capital expenditure last year of £100 million plus £2 million VAT, they are unlikely to have recovered much of that £2 million VAT. They can now seek to recover up to £200,000 each year for the next 9 years as their standard rates supplies increase. David Woodgate, Chief Executive of the Independent Schools Bursars Association, said the complexities of introducing the new system meant more time was needed before it came into effect. A short delay until September makes sense for all parties concerned, including HMRC. Our schools want to ensure they are fully compliant with the law but need clarity and support and a reasonable timescale. From the tax authorities, the implementation window is just not long enough for all interested parties to get everything in place. They don't care. They simply do not care if it's going to be a disaster. They do not care if Eton actually makes a profit off this change. This is just to punish the hard-working people because they believe that it's impossible to actually make a profit on anything because profit is just stolen labour. This is despite the net worth of these average individuals being millions of pounds. These people just join unions, absolutely suffer up the Marxist nonsense, and then go ahead to government and do anything they can for their friends in the unions, while everyone else has to pay for it. And then they need to punish absolutely anyone who is productive or is seen as privileged, which, don't get me wrong, going to private school is privileged, but it doesn't mean that you need to pay tax on it, given that education is absolutely not a luxury. So expect this absolute disaster to continue, expect all of their other policy to have completely unintended consequences that just makes everyone's life worse, and expect the clown decade to get worse before it gets better. Right, it's shill time. Tonight, it's Monday night, so it is our series on antiquity being hosted by me over at the Worcester Club, though it is basically a lecture from Jack, who knows pretty much everything there is to know about antiquity, the Roman period, the Greek period. We're covering the Peloponnesian Wars at the moment, so do go over there. There will be a community post on YouTube, and I will be retweeting it on Twitter, and we advertise it in the Discord, so please do follow all three of those methods. Tomorrow it's a Tosh newscast where we'll be covering this, Labour's Investment Summit, and the Tory Leadership Contest, along with other news that's been coming out over the past couple of weeks. Do come along to that as well. Again, announced on my YouTube channel, announced on my Twitter, announced over at the Worcester Club. Please join all three. Wednesday, I will be playing some more of Dustborn. I hate the game. Please come along if you like to see me rage at terrible writing and terrible gameplay. And then it is just videos out as and when I make them. So please do subscribe, become a member, all that good stuff for that. Right, that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you very much for watching. And until next time, goodbye.